Are animals talking? In a manner of speaking, they are. They may not use language the way humans use language, but they do communicate and share information constantly. The long-standing view that language is the greatest differentiator between Homo sapiens and the rest of the sentient world is undergoing a significant change within the scientific community. In a recent piece in the New York Times, science journalist and critically acclaimed author Sonia Shah wrote, and I quote, "For centuries, the linguistic utterances of Homo sapiens have been positioned as unique in nature, justifying our dominion over other species and shrouding the evolution of language in mystery. Now, experts in linguistics, biology, and cognitive science suspect that components of language might be shared across species, illuminating the inner lives of animals in ways that could help stitch language into their evolutionary history and our own." Unquote. To understand the question of language beyond humans, Mayank Shah report spoke to Sonia Shah, the author most recently of the critically acclaimed The Next Great Migration, The Beauty and Terror of Life on the Move.
Welcome to Mayank Shah Report. It's a great pleasure to have you, Sonia.
Great to be here.
Yeah. Let me start with a broad question. Are animals talking?
I guess it depends what you mean by talking. Are they using language the way we use language? I don't think that any scientist would say, I don't think many scientists would say yes to that. But I think most would agree, of course, that they are communicating. They are sharing information all the time. And in some cases, doing so intentionally in a way that's similar to the way that we intentionally communicate things to each other. We use symbols, we use representations to communicate with each other. And there's some evidence that other species do that too, which, makes sense because, of course, we all evolved from other species. So language has always been kind of this mysterious behavior we have that linguists and biologists for a long time thought, okay, we don't know where it came from because there's no precursors in the animal world, but that is starting to change.
You write in your New York Times piece that the cognitive and moral divide between humanity and the rest of the animal world has eroded. How significant is that erosion?
I mean, I think the fact that there are linguists now who will say that, yes, there are components of human language in other animals' communication systems is a sign of massive erosion. Because if you go back just a couple hundred years ago, the Linguistics Society of Paris in 1866 said, we don't want to even discuss how language evolved or how language might be related to anything in the animal world. They actually banned it. They wouldn't hear any papers on it at all because it was just considered an outlandishly irrelevant question, that language was just so special that you would never even look for any counterpart in the animal world. That was almost like offensive, So I think what we're seeing today, where there's linguists who are actually, getting grants with primatologists and ornithologists, and this divide has been breached, I think it's a real reversal historically.
Yeah. Are we then moving towards the view that language may not necessarily be a uniquely human superpower?
I mean, I think my takeaway from having done this research with the reporting the last 6 months, and this is also connected to my larger book project that I've been looking at these questions more broadly. Sorry, where were we going with this? What was the question again?
No, whether it's language is necessarily a human, uniquely human superpower. That view seems to be changing.
I think I think it could be unique to us, but not unique in any unique way. That is to say, maybe it is something that we are particularly adept with, and that we have developed, along this into the complexity of which we use it today. There may not be other species that do that in the same way, but the whole definition of a species essentially is that this is a unique group of
Right.
individuals, right? So the fact that we might have some unique characteristics doesn't mean that you can't still trace the evolution of this behavior and find counterparts in the natural world. So the elephant's trunk is a great example. That also is unique to elephants. There aren't other creatures that have a trunk like an elephant. But that's not to say that, God must have given the elephant his trunk. We still can have a naturalistic explanation for why elephants have trunks. So that is, maybe language is something that is unique to humans. But the fact that we're already seeing all these that language is a multi-component system, right? There's lots of different parts to it and lots of different layers to what makes language. And we see those in other species. So it's not this thing that kind of burst out in whole cloth and was given just to humans, right? Like there's pieces of it that we see in the natural world now.
But on the other hand, it strikes me that if you talk about 300,000 years of modern humans as we know it, if you compare the sheer evolutionary contrast between humans as a species and the rest of the animal world, aren't we? I'm not trying to advocate anthropocentric hubris here, but aren't we struck by the remarkable contrast between these two worlds in terms of the way we have evolved and the animal world has evolved when it comes to language?
I mean, language allows us to do collective decision making in a way that is very powerful. We don't all have to know each other intimately to exchange a lot of information that's complex. But there's other species that are more successful than us. I mean, there's just, if you look at biomass, insects and microbes and other species that are much more successful in just sheer numbers than we are. Other species that occupy more of the planet than we do. I mean, there's certain places we can't live, and there's places, there's bacteria that live in the,
Right.
sea vents and in these places that we couldn't go to at all. There are other species that have caused as much disruption and damage as we have. If you look into the deep past with anaerobic bacteria, and they changed the whole climate and actually nearly went extinct themselves. And, so, I mean, I think it depends on how you look at it, right? Like from our human perspective, like we just don't value the things that other species accomplish. So the fact that a termite can build this structure that is so complex and is many, many, many times larger than its body, right? Like what the termite can do with its structures our buildings don't compare at all. And they have natural cooling and heating, and they have different chambers. It's very complex. But we just don't really judge them by the same standards as we judge ourselves. So I think it's always kind of apples and oranges. Also, even embedded in the question you asked is this notion that we're talking about humans, which is one species, and then you want to compare this one species to animals, which is millions of species, right? So I mean, it's like, would you take purple out of the rainbow and say, well, how is purple different from all the other colors? I mean, yes, it is a different color, but it's not like the only color that has those unique characteristics.
Yeah, I was being deliberately provocative. Let me flip it then. It's entirely possible that the species that you mentioned, they are far along sophistication than we humans are. Then we just don't seem to have the faculty to recognize that. Perhaps we are dumber than we think.
I think we're just extremely self-centered, and when we say we, like I think it's worth questioning, who is we, right? Because I don't think, I mean, we don't know, but to me, the idea that humans are very special and that, you know, other creatures don't have any of these special qualities that we have, and what they can do is, you know, nothing is insignificant compared to what we can do, is you know, it's a way of thinking that emerged in a certain part of the world at a certain part of time and has become extremely influential, of course, and has, you know, spread across most of the planet. But that's not to say there aren't other traditions that didn't see things very differently, and some of those traditions are still intact, right?
Right.
So, you know,
What about the so-called human revolution of some 40 or 50,000 years ago, which seems at this point, even the way you have written, it seems exaggerated at this point. Do you agree?
yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in that, in the sort of archaeological and genetic
Yeah.
findings that have put that story together, but it's very interesting that many experts are now saying that this, you know, and this is big, the idea of a human spark is that, you know, 40,000, 50,000 years ago, something happened in human evolution where we just started taking off, and we just sort of, you know, left behind the evolutionary trajectory that had kind of constrained us and all the other species up until that time. And something kind of set us free. And you see this great flowering of human civilization and art and culture and language and all this stuff. And, you know, it's not to say that that didn't happen. That did happen. But was that a total departure? You know, was there some biological thing that happened, which has never been found, mind you? Like there's been lots of theories of maybe it was this, maybe it was that, maybe it was this gene, maybe it was this cognitive, you know, something happened in the brain, one little thing changed and everything, you know, there's all these theories, but nothing has really been proven of like, well, this is, you know, this is the culprit that made that change. But what has been found is a lot of continuity. You know, there was this idea that our other hominid ancestors like Neanderthals must have been very different from us, right? That, you know, they were completely, well, that we diverged entirely from them, right? That was part of this thinking. And then, you know, what we've learned from genetics is that we did not diverge at all. In
Right.
fact, they are our ancestors. We had families with them. Their genes are in our genes to this day, which to me also reflects on the idea of language. And we don't know if Neanderthals had language, but it's hard to imagine as much, you know, as much families that were made between like this level of intermingling that would leave their genes like studded throughout our genomes, that would have happened between a species that was linguistic and a species that was non-linguistic.
Right.
You know, I mean, I was talking to a neurobiologist named Eric Jarvis, and he said, and he studies birds, vocal learning in birds, and he said there's never a case where bird species can, you know, subspecies or different species can sometimes have families together, have offspring together, but it never happens that a vocal learning species, a species that, you know, has songs and can like imitate sounds and use sounds in this like complex communicative way, will ever have offspring with a species that doesn't, a species that just makes
Right.
the one call innate, it's instinctive, it's always the same. It just doesn't happen. And, you know, as a member of a linguistic species myself, you can that kind of makes sense, right? Like,
Yes. Yeah, it does.
so, you know, then you wonder, okay, well, what did set us apart? And if we just keep getting more and more evidence that, well, there's continuity here, there's continuity here, there's continuity here again, we're seeing continuity, and yet we cling to this idea that we diverged with no evidence for what might have accounted for that, then, you know, you have to start to wonder.
Right. I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you look at the question of time lag between the appearance of anatomical modernity and perceived behavioral modernity?
I mean, I don't know. There's lots of research going on that, of what might have happened. There's the one theory that I talk about in the piece a bit is this idea of domestication and self-domestication, which is I mean, it's a terrible term. Like I think the term is actually very confusing, but the general idea is that when animals become domesticated, meaning they're not aggressive and reactive, right? So like a wolf stops being aggressive towards a human and slowly becomes, calmer around humans, and they're able to live together more closely, more intimately. And eventually a wolf becomes what we know as a dog.
Right.
Even though I think, there's people who say that they're actually the same species. So there's just something else has changed. But once that happens, there's a whole suite of other changes that also happen, which biologists have noted, like, I think since Darwin's time, that they become like their foreheads get bigger, their eyes get bigger, their ears get floppy, they get spots on their fur. There's this whole, it's called a complex of a whole series of other seemingly unrelated changes happen when you have this domestication process happens. And maybe a better way of talking about domestication is just, the species become more social, like less aggressive towards sort of outsiders. And that's been seen in lots of different species. So not just, wolves and dogs, but lots of other cases as well. And one theory was that maybe that happened to humans because we, compared to Neanderthals or other ancient hominids, we exhibit those changes. Like the changes that made that between a wolf and a dog is similar to the kind of changes you see between the ancient humans and the modern humans. So these anatomical changes, right? It's also things like the smaller stature, smaller brains, actually. Less dimorphism between male and female. There's just a whole bunch of like really specific changes that happen. And it also, there's a new theory now that as that happens, that might sort of somehow facilitate more use, more language-like use in your communication. And they've seen that with in different bird species, that a bird species that was domesticated for its plumage, so completely unrelated to how it sang or anything. It was domesticated for its plumage, so it was bred to have white plumage instead of whatever it was in the wild. And they found that unexpectedly changed the way it sang. And so these birds that had been domesticated in this way had become more a calmer, less, they had less predator pressure, right? So they're not reactive all the time. It changed their songs. So they started singing in more innovative ways, more complex ways. They wouldn't mimic exactly what their tutors taught them. They would, change it up. And it was, it was more inventive. And they've seen similar changes in communication styles between wolves and dogs. One of the sort of prerequisites for communicating with another individual is this idea of joint attention. That is, if I point to something, that individual is going to look at it. And so when I start saying something or making some sounds, then it's going to recognize, okay, we're both looking at this one thing. We're going to talk about this one thing. So if you point at something to a dog will look where you're pointing. If you point at something to like a rabbit, they're not going to look where you're pointing. No. And a lot of other animals will just look at you look at your finger, not look at where you're pointing to. So this is the concept of joint attention, which is a prerequisite, and babies do it kind of really early on and stuff. And this is, if you don't do that, then you're not going to develop language properly. And dogs will do it. Dogs will look at your, pointed finger. They'll look in the direction of your pointed finger, but wolves won't. Right. Wolves won't do that. So it's not that dogs are talking or having more complex barks than wolves, but like the bird that was bred for the white feathers, there's something linguistic going on, like some greater linguistic complexity. And if humans also domesticated themselves in the sense that we became less aggressive, less hostile, more sociable to each other, maybe because we got rid of some of the big predators around us that were like, terrifying us all the time, maybe it was something like that, that would allow that, or we found some niche ecologically where it's like, okay, we don't have to worry so much all the time. So we can start being nicer to each other. We can start taking risks with, making our voices go up and down and have these different sounds all the time, which
Right.
maybe would have attracted predators in the past, who knows? This is all, pure speculation. But so the pure speculation is that maybe language is a result of domestication or becoming more social in some way.
Well, that's fascinating, domestication and language. I think it's a great point. You also write about an interesting, not a standoff, but interesting tension between the well-known behaviorist B.F. Skinner and Professor Noam Chomsky in 1959, and the skewering that Chomsky did of Skinner over the question of verbal behavior. Tell me a bit more about that. It's rather, because Chomsky is still around, still making an impact.
Oh yeah, he is. Yeah, I was not aware of this story, and it was pretty amazing. So B.F. Skinner was, I think he was like a pop star at the time in the 50s. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He was Man of the Year. He wrote best-selling books about psychology. That was his main, he was a psychologist, but also about child rearing and education and all different stuff. Utopian societies. He wrote about a bunch of different things, but his whole thing was, behaviorism, that you could just train people with reinforcements, negative or positive reinforcement, and then you could get them to do almost anything. So he worked with pigeons and rats, for example. I think those are his main study animals. And whenever like an animal cognition scientist or, wildlife biologist say, oh, we've discovered a giraffe that can do blah, blah, or we discovered, the dolphins can do this, or, whatever, some amazing animal behavior, he would then very carefully train his pigeon with like reinforcements to do the same thing. The pigeon can also dance like a monkey. Right. The rat can also go through this maze in 2 seconds, whatever it is, just through positive and negative reinforcements. So he was really kind of reducing all of behavior that way. And he would generalize from, if he did an experiment on a rat or a pigeon and he was able to train it to, to do calculus or whatever, then that he would extrapolate that, like, well, then we could train anybody, anytime, anything, right? So he made these very expansive claims, but they really captured the public imagination. So he was a big shot. But then he took on language, and he wrote this book in 1959 called Verbal Behavior. And I think he said something like, language is just like noise with meaning or something like that. Like I can't remember the exact quote, but it's something is kind of diminishing.
I think it makes perfect sense to me, really.
Right. Well, linguists who spend their whole careers studying language, it's much more complex than that for them, of course, right? Like that's their field. And so Noam Chomsky at the time, I think he was
30.
He was all of 30 years old. Yeah.
Right.
And B.F. Skinner was like this senior guy who was a big, really big shot. And Chomsky wrote this blistering 33-page review of this book by Skinner. And it became just an absolute sensation, just because it was so devastating. And he really took down the whole theory of behaviorism as being sort of nonsense and not really attending to the central questions about what we do, right? Which is, for him, was cognitive. It was all happening in our minds. Like, you just look at behavior, you're not explaining anything because you're not looking at the, what's really kind of controlling all that and why that might be. All the interesting questions he thought were cognitive. And so, and in the end, what was really remarkable is that the review just took the book down entirely. So the book, Chomsky's review, I think, was quoted like twice as much as the book itself was quoted in the academic literature. And then Chomsky's review ended up launching his career and also the whole kind of what's called the cognitive revolution. So all of these, in psychology and linguistics and all these other fields started, instead of looking at just, what are the words, what is the behavior, started looking at mental processes. And that's, kind of where they're still at today, by my understanding.
Yeah. If components of language might be shared across species, how long before, I think this is speculative, but how long before AI is deployed to create a linguistic bridge across species?
I mean, that's already happening. So there's at least 2 organizations that are working on this, and there's probably many other researchers. I mean, one of the problems that researchers have with kind of understanding what other species are communicating with each other is that they don't know what the segments are, like what the units are, so say if you have a whole dolphin whistle and it's very complex and it goes on up and down, la 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 la, well, you don't know what are the meaningful units to decode, right? Like if you just hear me talking, like we know what words are already, so we know, even though I'm stringing these sounds together, when to stop, like to kind of segment a part of my sound and say, okay, that's the meaningful part. I'm not saying a da ran away. I'm saying a dog ran away, right? That wasn't a good example, but you see what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, I understood completely.
Yeah. So this is a big problem. And then, people have attempted to say, okay, well, maybe in bird song, for example, or in whale song, or the chirps of squirrels or whatever, maybe when there's moments of silence, like that is the kind of end, that marks the beginning and the end of the meaningful unit, right? Like there's a little pause, so maybe that's it. But then there was some studies shown there's people who actually whistle. There's whistled languages that are pure whistling, and they can convey everything that our spoken language can convey. And they don't, if you analyze whistling languages by that metric, by, okay, look for the silences of that, and that's where the meaningful units begin and end, you'd get it all wrong. So there's all kinds of barriers like that. So anyway, so there's a bunch of groups and researchers that are now using AI and just training AI on all of these recordings and let the AI figure it out, just the way they trained ChatGPT and the other natural, large language models, whatever, to respond to questions and that we can just write or ask them. They were never taught grammar or vocabulary. They were just given like a whole corpus of text. And then they just figured it out, through kind of immersion, figure out the rules. And so maybe AI will be able to figure it out in a way that humans can't, which then brings up the interesting possibility that the robots will be able to talk to the animals before we will.
Yeah, indeed. I was wondering about what these 2 maple trees are talking. Maybe AI can tell me that they're gossiping about how dumb you look. So
that's right. Yeah.
Just a last couple of things. That does not seem to be an exclusively human vocal anatomy. I think that you make a reference to that, right? Tell me, I mean, I'm interested in that. Tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, so there was this idea for a long time that maybe humans could talk while nobody else could talk because we had something unique in our biology. And one candidate for that was our larynx, which is descended. So it's lower in our throat. And that actually allows us to make lots of different sounds, but it also gives us a choking risk, which is a pretty serious risk, right? Like that would kill babies. Like that is not adaptive to have a descended larynx in that sense, right? So the idea was, well, maybe the reason we have that is because there was this great payoff, the great payoff being that's what allowed us to have language because we have the descended larynx, right? So there's this big risk that comes with it, which is maybe why it's not more common, but we got this great benefit from it. So that's why we all have it now. And so it was just presumed that no other animals had a descended larynx. And then a biologist named Tecumseh Fitch at University of Austria or University of Vienna, he decided to actually look. And he started getting all these animals into this X-ray machine And I mean, it's kind of amazing science when you think about it, because first of all, he had to get like a goat to go into this X-ray machine, and then he has to get the goat to like vocalize while he's doing, so he's like, and I think what he figured out finally, which was not nice for these animals at all, but to separate them from their parents. So you get a baby in there and separate it from the mom, and then one or the other is going to vocalize.
I see.
So they got them to vocalize in that way, and probably other ways too. I don't know all the details, but when they did that and they vocalized under X-ray, they found that lots of other animals, they don't have a descended larynx all the time, but when they vocalize, their larynx goes right down to where ours is. So it behaves the exact same way. So they could do the same things with their voice and their larynx that we could do. There's nothing unique about it. And he also found one species, the red deer, that actually has the same descended larynx that we do.
I see. But on the other hand, language supremacists, as I call them, would argue that, say you have an example such as the Indian grammarian Panini, dating back to 5th or 6th BCE, who wrote this entire Ashtadhyayi, or 8 chapters, the basis for the Sanskrit language. They may say that chimps or mice or goats didn't do it 2,000 years ago. They didn't write any grammar, and they still haven't written any grammar. So why are we not superior? That's what they would argue. What do you say to that?
I mean, I think it's the difference between, there's different tools in the toolbox, right? We all live in different ecological niches. That's why we are different species. That's how we became different species. So to say a hammer is not a screwdriver, and how dare the screwdriver pretend to be, I mean, it doesn't make any sense, right? Like, so it's only if we're thinking of arranging everyone hierarchically that this question even becomes a question. Otherwise, it's just, of course, we're all different. We're all, we all radiated into different niches.
I find it hilarious, the hammer versus screwdriver. So I think it could be a great comic gig. If you ever did a science stand-up, this would work.